Welcome to the Bicurian Podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
While you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word, you embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Welcome to the show. I am Eric.
And I am Aisla.
So, we found an interesting article this week, and it prompted us to drop any other plans we had and cover this on the show.
It's true. I won't tell you what we were going to cover. However, it was scintillating.
We will be covering it later, but...
Or uncovering it. That's a hint. So, this article prompted a fun little Facebook interaction. And it was called, the title of it was Republicans Don't Understand Democrats and Democrats Don't Understand Republicans. And what drew my attention and prompted me to bring it to Eric's attention and suggest that we might want to dig into this concept a little bit is they talked about a study called the Perception Gap. And what they did was they asked members of the Republican Party or Democratic Party what their perception of the opposing party members' view would be of something. For example, one of the questions was, are Muslims good Americans? So they asked, conservative or Democratic Party person, what is your perception of the percentage of Republicans that would say Muslims can be good Americans? Right? And then they said to Republicans, what do you think? Are Muslims good Americans? And the gap was profound between the 2 points. The Democrats severely underestimated the number of Republicans who would say, oh, yeah, no, Muslims can be good Americans. And so I found that to be really interesting. Obviously you did. We were talking about it.
Yeah.
And then even more interesting to me was I posted this in several social media places, and the reaction to it, instead of being curious and intrigued, was kind of a little bit more vehemently upset than I expected. And so then we started having conversations about like the commitment to perceiving someone as bad who thinks differently than us. And so the article itself, we'll talk a little bit about that. And yet the other concept that we're interested in exploring kind of with each other and hopefully a little bit with you, we want you to think about this as we're talking about it, is what is your commitment level to really thinking that somebody who thinks differently than you is bad?
This really cuts to the quick on the entire Bicurian concept for me. The fact of the matter is, when we talk about fighting the bipolarization that's going on in the world, this is the root of it, right? Because we've become adversarial to the point where we're now defining our adversaries entirely based on perception and not always reality. And I'm not going to say that there are not people on the liberal or conservative side of things that do not, say things and then clearly you can say, oh, they don't like Muslims. Why? Because they said, I don't like Muslims in so many words or through some sort of law that they're pushing or whatever. But in general, in generalization, we have a whole different view of what the other side looks like. And they have a whole different view of what we look like than what we really are.
Well, and one of the things that I shared with you a few months ago is that, and I'm going to say his name, I have not looked up how to pronounce it, Anand Giridharadas. He just started working for Newsweek, and he had that video where he was on Morning Cup of Joe. It's a talk show.
Yeah, Morning Joe. Yeah.
There we go. Thanks. And he was talking about identity politics. And one of the things that I super appreciated about how he approached it is he said that there is this reflex that we have developed or become more accustomed to of judging a movement or an ideology by its excesses. So we start with the men's rights activists who are incels,
Yes.
right? And we judge the entire movement on these people, and because they're, I mean, be loud and extreme. However, when you get right down to it, there's this other core of like men's rights activists who are in some ways really just attempting to address the fact that like men are denied from a cultural perspective the right to be sad publicly or something like that. Like I've said from some friends who are people that I really respect who said, please look into this. Men's rights isn't the thing that you think it is. And I'm like, well, okay. And there is a core that has some grounding in some really practical things that are about, in some ways, countering toxic masculinity and the expectations that we have of men. And yet, if you say men's rights, most of the people that I'm close to immediately start with incels, right? And they're like, oh, it's the worst thing ever. It's so bad. They're terrible. Because we judge these things by the most extreme, excessive, loudest voices. And I appreciated his comment there. He was talking from a different perspective about race and gender and feminism. And yet I think that's really applicable. And so there's this thing too of like this perception gap is kind of taking and saying, okay, well, if you're here in this bucket, you must be all the way to the extreme.
Yeah.
And yet we know of ourselves that's not true. Like we all know that's true of ourselves.
I mean, short of people who might belong to various alt-right groups or whatever, I'm not sure that there are people that are in my life that would call themselves conservatives or Republicans that are as active as, to go out and march in the streets or something. So it is a perception thing, right? It's we need to actually acknowledge, I think, this article because they did some research and, I mean, it's by no means a massive study or whatever, but I feel like this is what motivated me to want to do this podcast and fighting this and finding common ground and understanding the other side and then compromising. We may not win all the time and they may not win all the time, but we used to have something that resembled politics in this country that were less divided, less filled with hatred and anger.
Well, and there's become, like, I think about it, from being a parent, and there's some comfort with childishness in a certain way in adults that is perplexing to me. And in terms of, there's this idea of saying that if something is true over here, it automatically means something about something over here. So, for example, I had 2 children, and if one of them needed new shoes, I took them to go get new shoes. It didn't mean I didn't care about the other kid or that I didn't want them to have shoes, right? It just meant that in this moment, what was true was this kid needed shoes. And yet, from a political perspective, we've gotten into this weird reflex of saying, well, if you're doing this for this person or this group or this situation over here, then obviously you don't care about like anything else.
Yeah.
When actually this might be the thing that you know how to do, or this is the need that you understand, or the thing that you can connect to. And so, and it's tricky because, and one of the things that came up in the one of the social media responses that we were into, that got brought up was this challenge around saying, well, we're just all the same, when obviously we do have very different lived experiences, like to be Black or brown or Muslim, disabled or gay or female. Those are all different experiences, right? And I also feel like that's a situation of like not really acknowledging, okay, there's a fundamental human experience we all have. And there are some things about that tend to be similar in our culture. And then there are some things that are different. Like my experience being a woman in in our society, and being a woman who likes to be in charge of things, like, so I deal with that, challenge is not the same as being a man who, you've talked about not wanting to climb the corporate ladder. Like, so you've almost the mirror experience, right? Like,
Yeah.
saying that we all have a human experience is not intended to dismiss the uniqueness of our other lived experiences. It's merely saying, let's try to find the places, like you were saying, where we can meet and actually find ways to talk and share so that we can maybe understand what some of those differences are.
Yeah. And some of the reactions that we saw, and I mean, we post articles all the time. We're active on social media. But the responses to this really caught me off guard because there was just vitriol around, no, all Republicans like to put kids in cages. Like, wow, I don't think that's true. But the person who said it seemed very convinced that that was probably true.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things so I like to do these little thought experiments. I think you're familiar with that. And one of them, I spent some time last year really trying to notice phrases that have no meaning. For example, if somebody says, nobody really cares, including me, like I start with me, that actually is a phrase that has no meaning. What that typically means is I see an issue that I feel I know something about, and having done no research or investigation, I'm going to decide that because it's an issue, nobody really cares. It's rarely actually true, and it's a meaningless phrase.
This is the basics of studying and understanding fallacies, and there's a lot of them. But
Yes.
it's a fallacy. It's an assumptive idea that you carry that has no merit because factually you haven't actually verified what's true.
So one of the things that came to me when I was thinking about this, so when I was in college, I went to, as I've shared before, a conservative Mormon college, Brigham Young University, and I had a roommate or housemate, there was a few of us living together, whose grandparents had not been Mormon, and their parents had joined the church, and partially the reason that they had decided to convert was because their grandfather was an alcoholic, the mother. And so she was attracted to a religion that didn't allow drinking. And so this friend of mine was very committed to alcohol is evil. And it causes all these problems and it creates addiction and misery and blah, blah, blah. And so, and this is also around, now I'm dating myself again, the rise of the internet. And so we're all living together. And she proceeds to get totally addicted to internet chat rooms and online gaming. I mean, and that was dial up. You had to be committed in those days. Like, it took forever to connect. And she totally blew off a semester and blamed her roommate. Her roommate was going through a lot of trauma. She's like, oh, your trauma is too hard for me. Whoa, hand to the head. I have to be on the internet. Completely used the internet the way someone might use alcohol to escape her life. And she would still rant about the evils of alcohol. And for me, it was a really interesting experience. And I tried to have this conversation because I was really foolish at that time and thought people wanted to hear things about, their own contradictions. I'll tell you that's not true. They don't. And but pointing out to her, your addiction to the internet is not really any different than your grandfather's addiction to alcohol. It's the addiction. It's the way that you are using a thing to escape your emotional experience that's interfering with your ability to meet your responsibilities. That's what's happening.
Which is a key point of addiction, right? Is if it's affecting your daily life.
Exactly. She was not functioning, and she was not receptive. We maybe had some heated conversation around it, but that was the first time that I really got clear that there's a distinction that can be difficult for a person to grasp, which is that difference between
the method, alcohol or the internet, and the destructive behavior. Like the destructive behavior was the addiction. Her grandfather chose alcohol, she chose the internet. And for me, that ties into this situation in that the conservative and the liberal communities have similar issues with each other, right? They think the other side is full of hate and super extreme and, unreasonable or hawkish and doesn't care about America or, like we have all of these extreme, but both sides actually feel the same way about each other. And that each side is super destructive. And so, and it's just they use different things, like it's, the liberals are ungodly and the conservatives are racist. That's our big attack word, right? But it's not a different perception. It's still diminishing a group of people to a set of behaviors or a set of identities or epithets, right?
Absolutely. I think we should probably. I want to go through a couple of the points of this article.
Okay.
Because they brought up like some of these numbers, and I found them really intriguing.
Okay, so what are you thinking?
What you brought up, like what people thought of Muslims and stuff like that.
Okay, so actually, this is the report, and so it might be more interesting.
Okay, so
this is what they drew on.
So we have the report here. We're gonna find some things here.
So, like the many Muslims, it was perception gap was 29%. So when they asked that question,
right, many Muslims are good Americans. The perception gap was 29%.
So Democrats thought that Republicans would be, it looks like maybe like
in the
39s in terms of Muslims are good Americans. And Republicans said, oh no, we think, and it's more
almost
like
70%.
70 something, right?
Said that many Muslims are good Americans.
And similarly, like sexism still exists in America. So this was like 48%. And we're looking at a graph, so it's a little hard to get the exact number, but we'll link to it in the notes so you can actually look at it yourself.
Yeah.
But the Democrats were asked to guess how many Republicans would say sexism still exists in America, and the Democrats said, like maybe 48% of Republicans would say it still exists, and it was more like 70%.
Yeah.
Said that no, it still exists.
And
look at this one.
Which one?
The government should do more to stop guns getting into the hands of bad people.
Right.
48% thought that Democrats thought Republicans would say they should stop. And what was like 69% of them were like, oh no, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so of course, the article also talks about how Republicans also have a caricature of Democrats. So, for example, Republicans approximated that only about half of Democrats are proud to be an American, despite the country's problems. And actually, more than 4 in 5 Democrats said they're actually proud to be American. Right. So the idea that Republicans have that Democrats hate being American and aren't proud of being American is equally flawed in their estimation versus what the Democrats that they polled actually said.
I like this one. Law-abiding citizens should have the right to bear firearms. Republicans estimated that 46% of Democrats would say that law-abiding citizens should have the right to bear arms, and actual Democrats were at 60%.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things, and it's one of the points that we've made on the show before, like this. Democrats absolutely believe in border security, and Republicans absolutely believe in humanitarian behaviors towards immigrants. Like it's not that simple to split it that way. Republicans focus on security. Democrats focus on humanitarian behavior, but it doesn't mean they don't think the other one exists and is important. It doesn't mean they still don't need to buy shoes. Like it's not a thing.
I know several people that are card-carrying members of the Democratic Party that own guns and believe in gun rights. So, my perception on that matches, the ideas there that, yeah, I would say about 7 in 10 of my friends that are Democrats really have no problem with guns. They don't necessarily think it's great that there's school violence. We've done shows on that and talked about how being anti the violence and being strict around things makes sense, right? But as far as being anti gun, the Republicans have a view that's just not real. And that's where this disconnect is happening. That's what's causing a lot of our problems.
Well,
We're fighting the other side and they're fighting us, but they're not actually what we are. The monster under the bed is not what it actually looks like.
well, and there's a weariness with. It seems to me like there's a weariness with actually giving people space to be human. One of the things that was in the article that I thought was also really interesting was they said the more educated you are, the more politically active and involved, the more you listen to the news, the more likely you are to have incorrect perceptions about people who hold differing views. It's one of the reasons that Vanessa Otero's media bias chart feels so critical to me.
Yeah.
That having our news labeled, like nutrition labels, like we talked about in that episode with her, so that people can actually assess, am I getting news or am I getting bias?
And is that bias creating an image of what the other side looks like that's not actually accurate?
Yeah. And the interesting thing for me, having been conservative and then becoming more liberal, I actually was very intentional about the news that I consumed for a very long time. I usually would subscribe to multiple papers that came to my doorstep that were actually physical things.
Yeah.
And I read them, and I would attempt to subscribe to something left-leaning and right-leaning because I understood that there was a variety of perspectives. And so it was, for me, that was a very particular thing for a long time. I didn't really know Facebook was news. That's what ended up creating the echo chamber for me, was not realizing that I had actually opted into a news source that wasn't news, but I was unconsciously treating it like that. And I was consuming so much bias that I had to do a lot of work. And I don't think I've finished untangling it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, I have some reflexes from years of not knowing I was consuming. It's like a news replacement source or whatever. It was a very upsetting thing to realize that had happened, that I had allowed that to happen.
Yeah. And again, that's where personal responsibility and critical thinking becomes such a key ingredient in what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And I'm using the collective we of us and our listeners. Like, we have to be diligent. We can't just fall for the thing that we think is happening. I mean, I listened to NPR and they talked about kids in cages for 45 minutes, and I know that it's a big deal, and I am adamantly opposed to it. They didn't once say, this name of this Republican is supporting this. He's literally standing there in the door with a key. But it's easy to say, oh, well, Trump and his cronies are doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And we start passing judgment on it, right? It's us versus them. Us liberals who want to free the kids, and those Republican conservatives that want to keep them in cages. That's not real.
Mm-mm. Yeah, it's really not. Well, and I feel like one of the things that I struggle with is 100%. I agree that, it's not okay. Like, what we were doing at the border is not okay. It's not our American values. I don't want to see that happening. And like you said, having somebody who is very vehemently clear that all Republicans support that,
Yeah.
it alienates the people who don't support it and are still, it's like they have values that they believe in, and they don't think it's okay for us to do what we're doing to these kids. And they're also trying to figure out how they stand for their values. And it's easy when those aren't your values to say, well, they just need to get over it. They're not important. because they're not your values. And that's exactly how they feel about the things that we care about.
Yeah.
And so it's a question of, how do you become the change you want to see in the world, right?
Well, it certainly probably isn't from dismissing 50% of the population of this country, which it doesn't feel like you're doing it because we live in our echo chambers. When you're dismissing all of those people, it's because you don't have a lot of conservative friends, and you probably already unfriended them on Facebook because of that fight you had 2 months ago or whatever in your comments. And now you live in an echo chamber. You are surrounded by your friends, but you don't necessarily get that 50% of this country voted for Trump. You are dismissing half of the country just because you don't see them every day does
Well,
not mean
25%, 50% of the voters, but
But my
Yeah.
point is, I mean, the country is pretty split right now with
Yeah.
active people. So, and we'll assume that you're probably not listening to this podcast from, purely academic standards. We're probably reaching out to people who are activists, who are active and doing things.
Mhm.
So, I mean, yes, we could try to get more people to vote and all of that, and then we could take a different poll and see how many people were actually Republican or Democrat. But 50% of the people who voted for Trump, and you're dismissing that.
Right. And that's what happened.
And
I
when
mean,
he gets reelected again in 2020, because we're so adversarial and we're just basically saying that everyone who voted for him was dumb, and that's your problem, because you think they're going to get punished by all of these things just as much as we are. We are wrong. We have to fight a critical thinking battle to get people to understand that the things that are happening are not good for the country, and they're not good for us or them. But doing it just by dismissing it that, oh, well, you want kids in cages, so I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to any Republican that wants kids in cages. You've just cut off enough people to get him reelected that are no longer going to listen to you either.
yeah.
One of my favorite quotes in this article is actually how they closed it out. I'm just going to read it here. It is deeply worrying that Americans now have so little understanding of their political adversaries. It is downright disturbing that their very institutions that ought to help us become better informed may actually be deepening our mutual incomprehension.
Yeah. So it's just, thank you. I think it's a really good point. And obviously this is an episode where we're not really going to have a conclusion so much as just really and truly, if you're 100% confident that somebody that you have zero interaction with thinks, feels, or believes something that is extreme, characterized, and quite possibly horrible, you might be making it up, and it's potentially worth your time to get some more information.
And it's okay to call out our allies when they say things that are blanket statements, that are fallacies, or just flagrant untruths. And I'm not saying that we have to give everyone a shot and that the world is full of love. We'd love to believe that. It's not. But what we do have to do is actually understand the people we're talking to, the people we're talking about.
Agreed.
And welcome to the Bicurian Moment.
Thank you for joining us. So my Bicurian moment is a tiered effect. Wayfair, which is the group that was building some of the accoutrement for the detention centers
It's a furniture company, right?
concentration camps at the border, had employees actually protest their involvement and walk out, and then Wayfair decided not to continue, and then they donated $100,000 to the Red Cross for support of immigrants coming across the border. And there was a commentary on that, and it said that's kind of like a cheap attempt at redemption. Like, instead of addressing the profit model that led to taking a job that had some maybe amoral stuff going on, they're just like, oh, we're going to throw some money at this and hopefully it'll go away, right? And so there was that one. And then the next one up was the LGBTQ community groups that work at Google in California, possibly nationally, but definitely California, actually asked San Francisco Pride to drop Google as a sponsor because of the recent situation with Carlos Maza. So he's a YouTuber, a Vox journalist who talks about LGBTQ issues, and he's received harassment on YouTube for a very long time. And because Google now owns YouTube, the LGBTQ community of Google is saying that this sponsorship of Pride is, I like this, a rainbow veneer of support for the community. Like they want to look good, but they don't actually want to do the work to be good. I want to be clear. I'm not making a statement as to whether or not I think what I think Google or Wayfair should do. I just want to put this out there that there's this like tension between these things. And then this last week, Bank of America decided that they wouldn't fund anything, any construction related to these detention centers. And so that's also, so there's this question that I have, like we're capitalist society. So money is kind of one of our measures of how we are successful and also try to redeem ourselves or be punished with fines and stuff like that. And the point that they made, the commentator made around the Wayfair situation kind of really struck me because he was saying, they're trying to buy redemption for super low price, 100,000, cheap. And they're not actually willing to do the work to understand how to be a culture that knows how to make better decisions as a company.
Yeah.
And similarly with the YouTube thing, or YouTube Rainbow Veneer support.
And it speaks to the larger issue of ethics in business, which
are there
gets a little gray a lot of the time. The number of companies that do things in favor of their bottom line at the expense of someone or something. It happens, and it's the reality, and we can vote with our dollar. I prefer to shop small and stay with local companies and stuff because greed fundamentally is going to be one of our biggest adversaries in any sort of activism that we're doing. Given the choice of making a dollar or supporting LGBTQ issues or something, most companies, even if they are founded on the idea of not doing that, will inadvertently do it. So, we can...
Do they inadvertently build concentration camps? I mean, that's another...
Well, that's a thing.
That's another level, right?
What I'm hearing here is the Bank of America figured out that the money that they were lending out was being used towards that. Whether they knew it ahead of time or not becomes the issue, right? And then choosing not to do it...
right?
Right, exactly. If they thought maybe nobody would bother digging into the books on it, they might not have cared.
I would hope that's not true. And...
But yeah, I mean, it makes sense, and it's rough. But, that's why, again, good solid news sources giving you information like that can help you be vigilant in how you want to do things. And you know what? I am more likely to actually look at Bank of America now because getting caught up in a situation where they might not have been intentionally trying to do something bad and now they're going to try to do good things makes me want to pay attention to them to see if they continue that behavior.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question. And so for me, that was kind of the bi-curious of it was this sort of question of, I don't want San Francisco Pride to lose their... I used to work in the community. I know how hard it is to fund these things. And so I'm like, and I also understand why the LGBTQ employees at Google are like, yeah, this doesn't feel good. They look good and they're not standing up for their people in profound ways that matter.
Yeah.
And so it's a question to ask. That's all I got.
Mine came from a conversation I had the other day with a wonderful person, but we were discussing masculinity, something that we've covered in a show before, and I'd like to revisit it probably many more times. Positive masculinity and what role models look like, and something occurred to me, and it's kind of been sticking with me since I heard the words come out of my mouth. But I think one of the reasons that I've liked sports my entire life is that was a source of good, positive masculinity. You see men of, certain stature, and they have power and influence. Nobody would argue Peyton Manning did not have some, influence. It was used for advertising because people cared about what Peyton Manning was doing. But I realized through sports, I saw the way that men could be masculine and be competitive and be good people. Now there's exceptions, of course. There's going to be the guy who beats up his girlfriend, but the leagues across all the sports punish that stuff. Those people are sanctioned and kicked out usually.
Hmm.
Even the culture of sports is that if you are the kind of person who gets a DUI or harms somebody in some way, you're not going to be allowed to play. So the culture there even promotes positive masculinity. So that just felt kind of good to have that realization that there are certain aspects of positive masculinity that I had been searching for and not even realized I was getting. So, pretty simple one, but just something profound that struck me the other day.
That's really neat. Thank you for sharing. Thanks for listening. Join our mailing list at bit.ly/bycure and get episodes and blogs conveniently emailed directly to you, mostly. Learn more about us at bycurian.com/podcast.
And if you like what we are doing, please rate us on your favorite listening platform of choice.
Thank you.